For exactly 1,825 days, Dominic Russo had not stepped foot outside his Chicago penthouse. The ruthless heir to the city's most feared syndicate was a ghost, paralyzed by the trauma of a car bomb that took his brother's life and shattered his own leg. He was content to rule his empire from the shadows, hidden away from the world, until a new physical therapist walked into his fortress. She was quiet, professional, and completely off-limits. But when her sleeve slipped, revealing a dark, violently shaped bruise around her delicate wrist, the ghost woke up. And for the first time in 5 years, the devil decided it was time to leave hell. The penthouse, at the top of the St. Regis Chicago, was less of a home and more of a meticulously gilded cage. At exactly 8 a.m., the heavy mahogany doors of the master suite opened, and Dominic Russo began his agonizing daily ritual. He leaned heavily on a custom-made carbon fiber cane, his right leg dragging with a distinct, rhythmic thud against the Brazilian walnut floors. Dominic was 34, but the silver threading through his dark hair made him look a decade older. 5 years ago, on a freezing November night beneath the concrete arteries of Lower Wacker Drive, a rival faction had wired his armored Lincoln Navigator with enough C4 to level a city block. His younger brother, Leo, had been driving. Leo died instantly. Dominic had been blown clear, surviving with a shattered femur, severe burns on his left shoulder, and a psychological fracture so deep it rendered him completely agoraphobic. The undisputed boss of the Russo family hadn't crossed the threshold of his front door since the day he was discharged from Northwestern Memorial Hospital. He ran his empire through encrypted servers, burner phones, and his fiercely loyal underboss, Tommy Berardi. The world outside believed Dominic was simply too arrogant to mingle with the masses. Only Tommy and a handful of trusted guards knew the truth. The mere thought of an open sky or an unpredictable street sent Dominic into crippling panic attacks. "Boss!" Tommy's voice crackled through the intercom on Dominic's massive oak desk. "The new physical therapist is downstairs. Security cleared her. No wires, no weapons. Her background check is cleaner than a convent. Abigail Weston." Dominic sighed, pouring himself 2 fingers of Macallan 18, despite the early hour. The pain in his leg was a vicious, biting thing this morning. "Send her up, Tommy, and tell the guards to stay out of the East Wing. I don't want anyone hovering." 10 minutes later, the private elevator chimed. Abigail Weston stepped into the foyer. She wasn't what Dominic expected. His previous therapists had been burly ex-military men or hardened sports medicine specialists who treated him like a fragile, dangerous explosive. Abigail looked entirely out of place in his dark, modern fortress. She wore simple navy blue scrubs, her auburn hair pulled into a tight, utilitarian bun. She held a medical bag in one hand, her knuckles white from gripping it too tightly. She was terrified. Good, Dominic thought. Fear meant compliance. "Mr. Russo," she said, her voice steady, despite the slight tremor in her hands. She didn't offer to shake his hand, a smart move considering his aversion to touch. "I'm Abigail. Dr. Henderson sent me. I've reviewed your chart." "Then you know this is a waste of time, Miss Weston," Dominic rumbled, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that hadn't been used for casual conversation in half a decade. He settled into a deep leather armchair, resting both hands on the head of his cane. "My femur was held together with titanium rods and a prayer. I will always walk with a limp. I will always be in pain. I only tolerate these sessions because my family doctor insists my muscles will atrophy if I don't." Abigail didn't flinch at his tone. She walked over, set her bag down, and looked him dead in the eye. "I'm not here to perform miracles, Mr. Russo. I'm here to ensure you keep the mobility you have. And if you're as stubborn as Doctor, Henderson warned me, we're going to get along just fine. Roll up your pant leg, please. Dominic's jaw tightened. No one ordered him around. Not politicians, not rival bosses, and certainly not a petite woman with eyes the color of a stormy Atlantic Ocean. But something about her clinical detachment intrigued him. He complied, pulling the dark fabric up to reveal the thick, jagged scars that mapped his calf and knee. For the next hour, Abigail worked on him. Her hands were surprisingly strong, finding the knots in his damaged muscles with an intuitive precision. She didn't try to make small talk. She didn't ask about the art on the walls or the men in suits standing by the elevator. She existed purely in the professional bubble she had drawn around herself. "You're tense," she noted softly, pressing a thumb into a particularly vicious knot behind his knee. Dominic hissed through his teeth. "I run a stressful business," he replied dryly. "Your body is fighting against itself. You have to learn to let go of the defense mechanisms, Mr. Russo. Not everyone is trying to hurt you." Dominic let out a dark, humorless laugh. "In my world, Miss Weston, the moment you believe that is the moment you end up in a closed casket." She paused, her eyes flickering up to meet his. For a fraction of a second, Dominic thought he saw a flash of profound, hollow understanding in her gaze. But it vanished, replaced by her clinical mask. She packed up her bag. "I'll be here Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 8 a.m. Ice the knee for 20 minutes tonight." As she walked toward the elevator, Dominic watched her go. He noticed a slight hesitation in her step, a stiffness in her shoulders that hadn't been there when she arrived. The ghost in the penthouse had found something to occupy his mind. A month passed. The rhythm of Abigail's visits became the only predictable anchor in Dominic's chaotic, violent life. Outside the glass walls of the penthouse, the Chicago underworld was brewing into a storm. The Costa family, a rival syndicate from the South Side, was encroaching on Russo territory, demanding cuts from the shipping ports. Dominic was spending his nights orchestrating brutal pushbacks, ordering hits, and managing millions of dollars in illicit cargo. But at 8 a.m., 3 days a week, the war ceased to exist. There was only the quiet hum of the climate control and the firm pressure of Abigail's hands on his ruined leg. They had developed a strange, silent rapport. She learned that he preferred silence over music, that he drank his coffee black, and that when the pain was unbearable, his left eye twitched. He learned that she smelled faintly of vanilla and medical-grade alcohol, that she chewed on her lower lip when she was concentrating, and that she always wore long sleeves, regardless of the stifling heat that the morning sun brought into the penthouse. It was a Wednesday in late July. The humidity outside was oppressive, baking the city concrete. Abigail arrived looking paler than usual. Dark circles hung heavy under her eyes, and her movements lacked their usual precise confidence. "Are you ill?" Dominic asked abruptly, as she began to massage the scar tissue around his knee. "I'm fine, Mr. Russo. Just didn't sleep well," she murmured, keeping her head down. Dominic didn't push. He closed his eyes, leaning back against the leather chair, trying to focus on his breathing. Abigail moved to stretch his hamstring, requiring her to lean over and apply her body weight. As she pushed forward, her foot caught the edge of the thick Persian rug. She stumbled, crying out softly as she caught herself against the armrest of his chair. In her haste to steady herself, the cuff of her navy blue scrub top rode up her forearm. Dominic's eyes snapped open. His reflexes, honed by a lifetime of violence, kicked in. He reached out to catch her elbow to keep her from falling completely. "Don't touch me," she gasped, ripping her arm away from him with a violent flinch, stumbling backward like a cornered animal. Dominic froze. His hand remained suspended in the air, but his gaze wasn't on her terrified face. It was locked onto her wrist. There, stark against her pale skin, were 4 deep, purplish-black ovals, fingerprints, the unmistakable bruising of someone who had been grabbed with brutal, punishing force. It wasn't a fresh bruise. It was a few days old, blooming with ugly shades of yellow and green at the edges. The silence in the room was deafening. Abigail hurriedly yanked her sleeve down, her chest heaving as she avoided his gaze. I'm sorry. I tripped." Dominic slowly lowered his hand. The icy, calculating Mafia boss, the man who ordered executions without blinking, felt a sudden, terrifying surge of white-hot rage claw its way up his throat. He knew violence intimately. He knew the difference between an accidental injury and intentional harm. Someone had held her down. Someone had hurt her. Who did that? Dominic's voice was barely a whisper, yet it commanded the room. "It was an accident," she stammered, frantically packing her bag. "I bumped into a door frame." "A door frame doesn't leave fingerprints, Abigail." He used her first name, the intimacy of it striking them both. He leaned forward, ignoring the screaming pain in his leg. "Who put their hands on you?" "It's none of your business, Mr. Russo. I have to go." She practically sprinted to the elevator, hammering the call button. Dominic didn't chase her. He couldn't, and he wouldn't. But as the elevator doors closed on her frightened face, his mind was already in motion. He picked up his secure phone and hit a speed dial number. "Tommy," Dominic growled, the beast fully awake now. "I need you to pull everything we have on Abigail Weston. I want to know where she lives, where she shops, who she talks to, and who she shares a bed with. I want her phone records, her banking history, everything." "Boss? She just left. Did she do something?" Tommy sounded alarmed. "No," Dominic said, coldly. "Someone did something to her. Find out who." By midnight, a thick manila folder was sitting on Dominic's desk. He sat in the dim light of his study, reading through the documents. Abigail Weston, 28. No criminal record. Top of her class at UIC. But the problem wasn't her past. It was her present. She lived in a modest apartment in Logan Square, and she was engaged to a man named Richard Lawson. Dominic flipped to the photo of Lawson, a Chicago Police Department detective, Vice Squad. But Lawson wasn't a clean cop. Dominic recognized the name immediately. Lawson was a notorious gambling addict, a dirty badge who fed information to the Costa family in exchange for covering his massive debts. Dominic stared at the surveillance photos Tommy's guys had taken earlier that evening. It showed Lawson grabbing Abigail roughly by the arm outside a grocery store, shouting in her face. The angle was clear enough to see the terror in her eyes. The pieces snapped together with sickening clarity. Abigail wasn't just a victim of domestic abuse. She was trapped with a man who belonged to the very people trying to destroy Dominic's empire. Dominic poured another drink, his knuckles white around the crystal glass. For 5 years, his world had been contained within 4 walls. He had convinced himself that nothing outside mattered, that he was safe here, untouched by the messiness of human connection. But looking at the fear on Abigail's face, the fortress felt less like a sanctuary and more like a tomb. He had to make a choice. Stay in the shadows, or step into the light and burn the world down for a woman he barely knew. Friday morning arrived with a torrential downpour. Thunder rattled the reinforced glass of the penthouse. Dominic sat in his chair, fully dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, his cane resting across his knees. He hadn't slept. When the elevator doors opened at exactly 8 a.m., Abigail did not step out. Instead, Tommy walked in, looking grim. He held a tablet in his hand. "Boss, you need to see this." Dominic's heart seized. "Where is she?" "She's downstairs, in the lobby." Tommy handed him the tablet. The screen displayed a live feed from the security cameras in the building's grand lobby. Abigail was there, backed against the marble concierge desk. Hovering over her, red-faced and aggressive, was Richard Lawson. He was in plain clothes, a windbreaker hiding the bulge of his service weapon. He was screaming at her, waving his arms, pointing a finger directly into her chest. The building's private security guards were circling, trying to de-escalate, but Lawson was flashing his CPD badge, screaming about jurisdiction and threatening to arrest anyone who touched him. "He followed her here," Tommy said quietly. "He thinks she's sleeping with a rich client for extra cash to pay off his debts to the Costas. He's demanding she go upstairs and get an advance. My guys in the lobby are waiting for your order. We can have him dragged into the alley and broken in half, but he's a cop. It'll bring heat." Dominic stared at the screen. He watched Lawson grab Abigail's injured wrist. He saw her face contort in agony, her knees buckling slightly as she tried to pull away. Something inside Dominic snapped. The psychological chains that had bound him to this penthouse for 5 years shattered into dust. The panic, the suffocating fear of the outside world, the phantom smell of burning metal and explosives, it all vanished, eclipsed by a violent, protective fury so absolute it cleared his mind of everything else. "Tell the guards to stand down," Dominic said, his voice terrifyingly calm. He stood up. He didn't lean on his cane. He gripped it like a weapon. "Boss?" Tommy stepped in his path, his eyes wide with shock. "What are you doing? You can't go down there. You haven't left this floor in 5 years. Let me handle him." "Get out of my way, Tommy," Dominic commanded. The raw alpha dominance rolling off him was suffocating. Tommy swallowed hard and stepped aside. Dominic walked to the elevator. He pressed the button for the lobby. As the doors closed, he looked at his reflection in the mirrored panels. He didn't see the broken, traumatized ghost he had been for half a decade. He saw Dominic Russo, the boss, the devil of the Gold Coast. The descent felt like it took an eternity. The numbers ticked down. 40, 30, 20. His heart pounded against his ribs, his breath shallow, the ghost of his agoraphobia clawing desperately at the edges of his mind. He focused entirely on the image of the bruises on Abigail's wrist. Ding! The lobby doors slid open. The chaos in the marble foyer immediately died down. The security guards snapped to attention, their eyes widening in absolute disbelief as they saw who was stepping out of the private elevator. Even Richard Lawson, mid-rant, froze as the heavy, rhythmic thud-click of Dominic's cane echoed across the cavernous room. Dominic walked with agonizing slowness, his posture rigid, his dark eyes locked onto Lawson like a predator that had finally found its prey. Abigail turned, her face pale, tears streaking her cheeks. "Mr. Russo," she whispered, horrified. She knew his condition. She knew what this was costing him. Dominic stopped 5 feet away from Lawson. He looked at the detective, then at the hand still gripping Abigail's wrist. "Let her go," Dominic said softly. The quietness of his voice was far more terrifying than a shout. Lawson sneered, puffed up with the false bravery of a man who thought his badge made him invincible. "Who the hell are you? The cripple she's massaging? Back off, buddy. This is domestic business. Police business." "You have exactly 3 seconds to take your hand off my physical therapist, Detective Lawson," Dominic replied, using the man's rank and name deliberately. Lawson's eyes flickered with a brief flash of uncertainty. "How do you know my name?" "I know your name." Dominic took a step closer, towering over the cop. "I know your badge number. I know you owe the Costa family $300,000. And I know that if you don't release that woman right now, I will ensure that not only do the Costas collect your kneecaps by midnight, but the Internal Affairs Division gets the flash drive currently sitting on my desk, detailing every bribe you've taken, since 2022. Lawson went completely white. His hand dropped from Abigail's wrist as if she had suddenly caught fire. He took a step back, finally looking at the men surrounding them. The security guards weren't regular mall cops. They were Russo men, and their hands were resting casually on their lapels, dangerously close to concealed weapons. "Russo," Lawson breathed, the realization hitting him like a freight train. "You're Dominic Russo, and you are a dead man walking if you ever come within 100 yards of this building or this woman ever again," Dominic said. "Now get out of my sight before I change my mind and have you gutted on my front steps." Lawson didn't say another word. He turned and practically ran for the revolving doors, disappearing into the Chicago rain. The lobby was dead silent. Dominic stood there, his chest heaving, adrenaline masking the severe pain in his leg. The vast open space of the lobby was beginning to press in on him. The sheer volume of the world outside the glass doors, the cars, the noise, the sky, started to trigger the familiar, suffocating panic. The room tilted slightly. Before he could lose his balance, soft hands were on his arm. "Breathe, Dominic," Abigail said softly, stepping into his line of sight, blocking out the overwhelming expanse of the lobby. It was the first time she had used his first name. "Just look at me. Only me." He focused on her eyes, the stormy ocean grey. He saw gratitude, shock, and a deep, profound understanding. "Let's go back upstairs," she whispered, gently guiding him back toward the elevator. As the doors closed on the outside world once more, Dominic knew one thing with absolute certainty. His isolation was over. The war had just begun, and for the first time in 5 years, he had something worth fighting for. The doors of the private elevator slid shut, sealing out the lobby, the noise, and the paralyzing expanse of the world below. Inside the steel box, the silence was absolute, broken only by the ragged, uneven sound of Dominic Russo's breathing. The adrenaline that had propelled him downstairs, a blazing, white-hot inferno of protective rage, was evaporating, leaving behind a cold, sickening void. Dominic leaned heavily against the mirrored wall of the elevator, his knuckles bone-white as they gripped the silver head of his cane. His right leg, pushed far beyond its physical limits, throbbed with a blinding agony that threatened to buckle his knee. But worse than the physical pain was the psychological tidal wave crashing over him. He had left the penthouse. He had stood in the open lobby. He had exposed himself. His chest heaved as the phantom scent of burning rubber and detonated C4 filled his nostrils. The polished steel of the elevator seemed to warp, the walls closing in. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block out the memory of his brother's lifeless body in the driver's seat. "Dominic." The voice was soft, cutting through the roaring in his ears. "Dominic, open your eyes. You're safe. We're going up." He forced his eyes open. Abigail Weston was standing right in front of him. Her professional mask was gone, replaced by a raw, unvarnished empathy. She wasn't looking at him like he was a terrifying Mafia boss, nor was she looking at him like a broken invalid. She was looking at him like a man who was drowning, and she was offering a lifeline. Without asking permission, she reached out and placed her small, warm hands flat against his chest, right over his racing heart. "Breathe with me," she instructed, her voice a steady, rhythmic metronome. "In for 4. Hold for 4. Out for 4. Do it, Dominic!" He obeyed. He matched his breathing to the gentle pressure of her hands. By the time the elevator chimed at the penthouse floor, the suffocating grip of the panic attack had loosened into a dull, manageable ache. The doors opened, revealing the cavernous, quiet expanse of his home. Tommy and 2 heavily armed guards were already waiting in the foyer, having taken the service elevator up in a dead sprint. They stood rigid, eyes wide, with a mixture of awe and deep concern. "Boss," Tommy started, stepping forward. "I'm fine," Dominic rasped, waving him off. He forced himself to stand straight, though every nerve in his right leg was screaming. He looked down at Abigail. "My office, now." He didn't wait for her to respond. He limped across the hardwood floor, the heavy thud of his cane echoing through the silent penthouse. Abigail followed, clutching her medical bag to her chest. Once inside the dark, wood-paneled office, Dominic collapsed into his leather chair behind the desk. He poured a glass of bourbon with a shaking hand and downed it in one swallow. The burn grounded him. Abigail stood near the door, looking entirely out of place amidst the bulletproof glass, the monitors displaying security feeds and the unmistakable aura of organized crime. "Take a seat, Abigail," Dominic said, his voice regaining its usual gravelly authority. She sat on the edge of the Chesterfield sofa, keeping her knees pressed tightly together. She looked down at her lap, her thumb subconsciously tracing the cuff of her sleeve, hiding the brutal bruises Lawson had left on her wrist. "You can't go back to your apartment," Dominic stated flatly. It wasn't a suggestion, it was an edict. Her head snapped up. "What?" "Of course I have to go back. My things are there. My life is there. Your life as you knew it ended the moment Richard Lawson grabbed you in my lobby," Dominic countered coldly. "He knows who I am. He knows I protected you. A dirty cop who owes 300 grand to the Costa family isn't just going to walk away with his tail between his legs. He's desperate, Abigail. Desperate men are unpredictable. If you go back to Logan Square, he will be waiting for you. And next time, he won't stop at grabbing your wrist." Abigail paled, the reality of her situation sinking in. "I can go to the police. I can get a restraining order." Dominic let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "He is the police. His buddies in Vice will lose the paperwork before the ink is dry. In my world, a restraining order is just a piece of paper that tells a killer exactly where to find you." "Then what am I supposed to do?" she asked, her voice cracking. The dam she had built to hold back her fear was finally breaking. "I don't have anywhere else to go. I don't have family here." "You stay here," Dominic said smoothly. Abigail stared at him. "Here, in the penthouse? I have 5 guest suites. You'll have your own space. My security detail will ensure no one gets within a 5-block radius of you. Tommy will arrange to have your essentials packed and brought here by tonight. Your lease will be broken, and your name will be wiped from the public registry." "You're talking about making me disappear," she whispered, a new kind of fear creeping into her eyes. "Why are you doing this? I'm just your physical therapist. I'm a nobody. You risked your own safety, your own sanity, to come down to that lobby." "Why?" Dominic looked at her. He thought about the 5 years of utter darkness he had lived in. He thought about the ghost he had become, a man who felt nothing but pain and phantom explosions. Then he looked at her bruised wrist, and he felt the fire again. "Because," Dominic said slowly, his dark eyes locking onto hers with terrifying intensity, "for 5 years, I have allowed the world to dictate what I can and cannot do. I have lived in a cage. But you brought a sliver of light into this tomb, Abigail, and I protect what is mine." She opened her mouth to argue the mine part, but the sheer, overwhelming presence of the man silenced her. She was trading one dangerous man for another, she realized. But as she looked at Dominic Russo, she knew that this monster, at least, would never raise a hand to hurt her. "Fine," she breathed, yielding to the inevitable. "I'll stay." Dominic nodded once. "Good. Now, get your bag. My leg is on fire, and you owe me a session." 3 days passed in a strange, suspended reality. Abigail's entire existence was now confined to the top floor of the St. Regis. Her suite was lavish, larger than her entire apartment, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lake Michigan. True to his word, Tommy had sent a team to clear out her apartment, bringing her clothes, her books, and her meager possessions. The dynamic between Abigail and Dominic shifted dramatically. The clinical detachment was gone. In its place was a heavy, unspoken tension that hummed between them like a live wire. She continued his physical therapy, but the sessions were no longer silent. "Push harder," Dominic grunted, lying on his back on the leather examination table, sweat beading on his forehead as she stretched his scarred hamstring. "If I push harder, I'll tear the muscle, Dominic," she shot back, not backing down. She had stopped calling him Mr. Russo. "I can take it. Your ego can take it. Your ligaments can't." She eased the stretch, letting his leg rest. She reached for a towel and tossed it onto his chest. "You're pushing yourself too much. Since the incident in the lobby, you've been pacing the halls. You're aggravating the bone grafts." Dominic sat up, wiping the sweat from his face. "I don't have the luxury of resting, Abigail. The board is moving." He wasn't lying. The atmosphere in the penthouse had become electric with impending violence. Men in dark suits came and went at all hours. Burner phones rang incessantly. The scent of espresso and gun oil permeated the air. Late that evening, Abigail was in the massive kitchen, brewing a cup of chamomile tea when Tommy walked in. He looked exhausted, his tie loosened, a thick file tucked under his arm. "Can't sleep?" Tommy asked, pouring himself a glass of water. "Hard to sleep when half the Chicago underworld is having meetings in the living room," she replied dryly. Tommy chuckled, but the sound lacked humor. "It's about to get a lot worse, Miss Weston." Abigail paused, the tea bag hovering over her mug. "What happened?" Tommy glanced toward the closed doors of Dominic's office, hesitating. Then he sighed. "Lawson didn't just run away to lick his wounds. He went straight to Carmine Costa, the boss of the South Side." Abigail's blood ran cold. "Richard went to the Mafia?" "He was already in their pocket," Tommy explained. "But now, he had something valuable to sell them. He told Carmine that Dominic Russo, the ghost who hasn't been seen in 5 years, came down to the lobby for a physical therapist. He told them Dominic is walking with a severe limp, that he looks weak. And worst of all, he told them that you are the leverage they need to pull Dominic out of his fortress." The mug slipped from Abigail's hand, shattering against the marble floor, hot water splashing across her bare feet. She didn't even feel the burn. The kitchen door swung open, and Dominic stood in the frame. He looked at the shattered mug, then at Tommy's guilty face, and finally at Abigail's terrified expression. "Get out, Tommy," Dominic said, quietly. Tommy nodded and quickly exited, leaving them alone. Dominic limped forward, completely ignoring the shards of ceramic on the floor. He stopped mere inches from Abigail. She was trembling, her arms wrapped around herself, as if trying to hold her body together. "They're coming for me," she whispered, the horror of it crushing the breath from her lungs. "Richard sold me to them. They're going to use me to get to you." "They are going to try," Dominic corrected, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "I'm a liability," she cried, stepping back, her bare foot narrowly missing a jagged piece of the mug. "You need to let me go, Dominic. If I leave the city, if I run away, if you run, you are dead," Dominic snapped, his sudden volume making her flinch. He instantly softened his tone, stepping forward and doing something he hadn't done since she arrived. He reached out and gently gripped her shoulders. His large hands were warm, anchoring her to the floor. "Listen to me, Abigail," he murmured, leaning down so they were eye to eye. The Costas don't care if you run to Alaska. They will find you, and they will use you to hurt me. Because they know." He paused, his dark eyes searching hers, the walls of his emotional fortress crumbling. "They know that you mean something to me." Abigail's breath hitched. She stared up at the ruthless Mafia boss, seeing the absolute sincerity in his scarred, beautiful face. The tension that had been building between them for weeks finally crystallized into something undeniable. It wasn't just protection. It was obsession. It was possession. It was care. "I won't let you be a victim anymore," Dominic said softly, his thumb brushing a stray curl away from her cheek. "I won't let Lawson or Carmine Costa or anyone else put their hands on you. But staying hidden in this tower isn't enough anymore. If you stay with me, you can't just be a civilian in a gilded cage." "What are you saying?" she asked, her heart hammering wildly. "I'm saying that tomorrow, we are leaving the penthouse. We are going to a secure compound outside the city. And you are going to learn how to shoot a gun. You are going to learn how to defend yourself." He stepped closer, the heat of his body wrapping around her. "You trade the fear for power, Abigail. Will you do that for me?" She looked into the eyes of the devil, a man who commanded killers and ruled an empire of shadows. She thought of Richard's cruel hands, the bruises that still faded on her wrist, and the life of fear she had been living. Abigail stood up taller. "Yes." Dominic smiled, a dark, predatory curve of his lips. "Good girl." The armored Cadillac Escalade was a rolling tank, equipped with bulletproof glass and reinforced steel plating. It idled in the underground loading dock of the St. Regis, the engine a low, powerful growl. Dominic stood by the open rear door, his cane planted firmly on the concrete. He was staring at the dark interior of the vehicle, his breathing shallow. It was the first time he was getting into a car since the night Lower Wacker Drive exploded. Tommy stood a few paces away, giving the boss his space, while a half-dozen heavily armed men secured the perimeter. Abigail was already inside the SUV. She slid across the leather seat and looked out at Dominic. She could see the battle raging behind his eyes, the raw, paralyzing PTSD clawing at his mind. She didn't offer pity. Pity wouldn't help a man like Dominic Russo. "Dominic!" she called out, her voice calm and commanding. "Get in the car." He blinked, pulling his gaze away from the floorboards. He looked at her, his jaw locked tight. Slowly, agonizingly, he climbed into the back seat, pulling his stiff leg in behind him. The door slammed shut, sealing them in a quiet, heavily fortified bubble. As the convoy pulled out of the garage and onto the sunlit streets of Chicago, Dominic closed his eyes, his hands gripping his knees so hard his knuckles turned translucent. He was rigid, waiting for the blast, waiting for the heat, waiting for the world to end again. Abigail reached across the center console. She didn't say a word. She simply pried his rigid fingers away from his kneecap and interlaced her hand with his. Dominic's eyes snapped open. He looked down at their joined hands. Her palm was soft, but her grip was firm, grounding him in the present. He let out a long, shaky breath, turning his hand to hold hers properly. For the rest of the 40-minute drive to the Russo family estate in Barrington, he didn't let go. The compound was a sprawling stone mansion, hidden behind 10-foot wrought-iron gates and acres of dense forest. It was a fortress designed for war. For the next 2 days, the estate became their sanctuary and their training ground. Dominic handed Abigail over to his top enforcer, a quiet, deadly man who spent hours teaching her the mechanics of a Glock 19. Dominic watched her from the patio, leaning on his cane, a profound sense of pride swelling in his chest. Abigail didn't cry. She didn't flinch at the sound of the gunfire. She learned to plant her feet, control her breathing, and fire with lethal accuracy. The terrified woman who had been bullied by a dirty cop was systematically being burned away, replaced by a mob boss's queen. On the third night, a thunderstorm rolled over the estate, plunging the grounds into darkness. Abigail was in the library, sitting by the fireplace, methodically field-stripping and cleaning the Glock, just as she had been taught. Dominic walked in, a tumbler of whiskey in his hand. He wore no jacket, his white dress shirt unbuttoned at the collar, revealing the edge of the brutal burn scars on his left shoulder. He watched her reassemble the weapon with a satisfying click. "You're a fast learner," Dominic murmured, stepping closer. Abigail set the gun on the table and stood up. "I have a good reason to learn." Dominic stepped into her personal space, the scent of gun oil, vanilla, and aged whiskey wrapped around them. He reached out, his fingers lightly tracing the jawline of her face. "Lawson will never touch you again. I promise you that." "I know," she whispered, looking up at him. The fear was entirely gone from her eyes, replaced by a heavy, intoxicating heat. "I'm not afraid of him anymore, Dominic. And I'm not afraid of you." Dominic's control, the iron discipline he had maintained for years, finally shattered. He dropped his cane. It clattered loudly against the hardwood floor. He wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her flush against his body, and brought his mouth down on hers. The kiss was desperate, violent, and hungry. It was the release of 5 years of isolation, months of simmering tension, and the desperate reality of their circumstances. Abigail gasped, her hands tangling in his dark hair, kissing him back with equal ferocity. He walked her backward until her spine hit the heavy oak bookshelves, his body pressing her into the wood, his mouth devouring hers. For a single, perfect moment, the war didn't exist. There was only the fire between them. Then, the library doors flew open. "Boss!" Tommy shouted, his gun already drawn, his face pale with panic. Dominic ripped himself away from Abigail, his instincts instantly pivoting from passion to murder. He shielded her behind his body, reaching down to grab the Glock she had just cleaned from the table. "What is it?" Dominic barked. "The perimeter is breached," Tommy said rapidly, locking the heavy library doors behind him. "It's the Costas, dozens of them. They bypassed the outer sensors. Someone gave them the security codes, boss. We have a mole." Outside the window, a brilliant flash of light illuminated the pouring rain, followed a second later by the deafening roar of an explosion near the front gates. The house shook, dust falling from the ceiling. Dominic's worst nightmare was repeating itself. The smell of smoke began to filter through the cracks of the doors. But this time, he wasn't trapped in a car, he wasn't a victim, and he wasn't alone. He looked back at Abigail. She wasn't screaming. She reached into the desk drawer where they kept the spare magazines, grabbed 2, and shoved them into her pockets. She looked at him, her ocean-grey eyes hard as steel. "Stay behind me," Dominic ordered, racking the slide of his weapon, the sound cutting through the chaos outside. "Tommy, get the men to the East Wing hallway. We bottleneck them there. No one gets past that door alive." The Devil of the Gold Coast had finally returned to the fight, and heaven help anyone who stood in his way. The heavy oak doors of the library vibrated against their hinges as automatic gunfire erupted down the main corridor of the estate. The unmistakable, rhythmic crack-crack-crack of high-caliber rifles tore through the quiet elegance of the Barrington compound, shattering centuries-old vases and ripping through expensive oil paintings. Inside the library, the world had shrunk to a horrifying, tactical reality. Dominic Russo's mind, which had spent 5 years paralyzed by the echo of a single explosion, was now operating with terrifying clarity. He didn't freeze. The ghost was dead. The boss was alive, and the woman he loved was standing right behind him, armed and waiting. "Tommy, flip the heavy desk. Use it as cover," Dominic barked over the deafening noise. "Abigail, stay low. Keep your back against the stone fireplace. Do not fire until they cross the threshold." Tommy hoisted a massive antique mahogany desk onto its side with a grunt of exertion, creating a makeshift barricade facing the double doors. Dominic knelt behind it, resting the barrel of his Glock on the polished wood, his damaged leg stretched out awkwardly beneath him to manage the pain. "They cut the main power, boss, but the backup generators should kick in any second," Tommy shouted, checking his magazine. "We have 6 guys holding the East Wing, but the Costas brought an army, and we still don't know who gave them the gate codes." "It doesn't matter right now," Dominic replied coldly, his eyes locked on the rattling doorknobs. "Anyone who isn't wearing a Russo suit dies. Understood?" "Understood." Suddenly, the gunfire in the hall ceased. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the house, punctuated only by the torrential rain pounding against the reinforced glass windows. Then, a voice echoed from the other side of the heavy doors. "Dominic, it's Carmine Costa." The Southside boss's voice was coarse, raspy from decades of cigars. "Your boys in the East Wing are dead. You're surrounded. Send out the girl and maybe I'll let you limp out the back door. Keep her, and I burn this mansion down with you inside." Dominic's jaw tightened into steel. He looked back at Abigail. She was crouched by the stone hearth, the Glock 19 gripped tightly in her hands. She was terrified, her chest heaving, but her eyes were locked onto Dominic with absolute, unwavering trust. She shook her head once. She wasn't surrendering. "Carmine!" Dominic yelled back, his baritone voice cutting through the thick oak doors. "You crossed a line tonight. You brought a war into my home. There are no negotiations. If you want her, you come through me." A dark chuckle rumbled from the hallway. "Have it your way, cripple. Breach it." A massive force slammed into the library doors. The heavy wood splintered inward as a battering ram tore the lock to shreds. The doors burst open, and 3 of Costa's enforcers poured into the room, assault rifles raised. Dominic didn't hesitate. He squeezed the trigger twice in rapid succession. Bang! Bang! The lead enforcer dropped to the floor, a bullet lodged perfectly in his chest. Tommy opened fire a fraction of a second later, taking down the second man in a spray of blood and shattered glass from the chandelier above. The third man dove behind a leather armchair, returning fire. Bullets chewed into the mahogany desk where Dominic and Tommy were taking cover, sending vicious splinters flying through the air. One grazed Dominic's cheek, drawing a thin line of warm blood. But he didn't even flinch. "Cover me!" Dominic shouted, shifting his weight. Tommy laid down suppressive fire while Dominic leaned out, aiming with lethal precision, and put a bullet through the thin leather of the armchair, hitting the man hiding behind it. The gunfire in the room stopped. "Clear!" Tommy yelled. But as Tommy stood to check the corridor, a figure stepped silently out of the shadows from the adjacent reading room, a secret entrance only Russo men knew about. It was Sullivan, one of Dominic's most trusted lieutenants. Dominic's eyes widened in realization. The mole. Sullivan had the gate codes. Sullivan knew the layout of the house, and right now, Sullivan was raising a suppressed pistol, aiming directly at the back of Tommy's head. "Tommy, drop!" Dominic roared, raising his weapon, but he was out of position, his bad leg slowing his pivot by a vital microsecond. Sullivan's finger tightened on the trigger. Bang! The gunshot didn't come from Dominic. It didn't come from Sullivan. Sullivan staggered forward, a look of profound shock washing over his face. He dropped his weapon, clutching his shoulder as a dark red stain rapidly blossomed across his suit jacket. He collapsed to his knees, gasping for air. Dominic whipped his head around. Abigail was standing by the fireplace, both hands gripping the Glock, the barrel smoking. Her stance was perfect, exactly as she had been taught, but her entire body was trembling violently. She had just shot a man. Tommy spun around, realized what had just happened, and immediately kicked Sullivan's dropped gun away before planting a boot on the traitor's chest. Dominic ignored Sullivan entirely. He scrambled to his feet, ignoring the searing agony in his femur, and closed the distance to Abigail in 3 large strides. He gently took the hot weapon from her rigid fingers, engaging the safety and tossing it aside. She looked up at him, her eyes wide, glassy with shock. I shot him. He was going to kill Tommy, Dominic. I had to. I know, Dominic murmured fiercely, pulling her into his chest, wrapping his massive arms around her trembling frame. He pressed his face into her auburn hair. You did perfectly, Abigail. You saved his life. You saved us. Breathe. Just breathe. Boss, Tommy called out, his voice tight. The generator is kicking on. We need to move. Costa's main force is coming up the grand staircase. We can't hold them here. Dominic pulled back, framing Abigail's face with his hands. Look at me. We are leaving. We are taking the subterranean tunnels to the garage. You stay right behind me. Do you understand? She swallowed hard, nodding. I understand. Let's go, Dominic commanded. Tommy dragged the bleeding, groaning Sullivan to his feet by the collar. You're coming with us, you piece of garbage. You have a lot of explaining to do. Kelso. They moved swiftly through the hidden panel in the library wall, descending into the damp, concrete tunnels beneath the estate. Above them, they could hear the muffled shouts of Costa's men tearing the mansion apart. But the devil had already slipped through the cracks, taking his queen with him into the dark. The secondary safe house was a far cry from the opulent penthouses and sprawling estates Abigail had seen so far. It was a gritty, heavily reinforced steel warehouse in the heart of Pilsen, situated above a defunct auto body shop. The air smelled of motor oil, stale coffee, and rusted metal. Abigail sat on a battered cot in the corner of the room, a coarse grey blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She was staring blankly at her hands, the phantom recoil of the Glock still vibrating through her bones. Across the room, Tommy had Sullivan tied to a heavy metal chair. The traitor was pale, sweating profusely from the untreated gunshot wound in his shoulder. Dominic stood over him, his face a mask of terrifying, icy calm. He had shed his suit jacket, his white shirt stained with dirt, and a streak of his own blood from the splinter that had grazed his cheek. I'm going to ask you once, Sullivan, Dominic said, his voice barely above a whisper, and your answer will determine whether you die quickly or whether I keep you alive for a week while my men practice their knife work. Why did you sell the gate codes to Carmine Costa? Sullivan coughed, spitting a wad of bloody saliva onto the concrete. Lawson, the cop. He came to Carmine, offered him a deal. Said you were weak, boss. Said you were a cripple who couldn't even walk out his front door. Carmine offered me $2 million and my own crew to open the gates. Dominic's expression didn't change, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Where is Carmine right now? And where is Richard Lawson? They're celebrating, Sullivan wheezed, his head dropping. Carmine thinks you died in the fire at the estate. They set a meeting for tonight to carve up your territories. The private dining room at Jean and Georgette's. Midnight. Lawson is there to collect his payout. Dominic looked at Tommy. End him. Dominic turned his back and walked toward Abigail, the heavy thud of his cane masking the muffled thwip of Tommy's suppressed pistol behind him. Abigail squeezed her eyes shut, pulling the blanket tighter, but she didn't turn away. This was the world she had chosen. Dominic sat down heavily beside her on the cot. The adrenaline was finally leaving his system, and the physical toll of the night was settling into his ruined leg. He leaned his cane against the wall and buried his face in his hands, exhaling a long, shuddering breath. Abigail reached out, her small hand gently touching his broad shoulder. "Your leg is hurting." "It's nothing," he muttered, not looking up. "Don't lie to me, Dominic," she said softly. She shifted closer, discarding the blanket. She gently lifted his injured leg, swinging it onto the cot so it was elevated, her hands intuitively finding the knot of scarred muscle behind his knee. She began to massage it, applying the firm, professional pressure she had used in the penthouse, grounding both of them in a familiar routine amidst the chaos. Dominic let his head fall back against the concrete wall, a low groan escaping his throat as her hands worked away the vicious cramping. "You shouldn't have had to do that tonight," he said quietly, opening his eyes to look at her. "You shouldn't have blood on your hands." "I did what was necessary," Abigail replied, her voice steadying. She looked down at his scars. "You told me to trade fear for power." "I did. Richard Lawson made me feel like a helpless victim. When that man pointed a gun at Tommy, I realized I am not helpless. Not anymore." Dominic reached out, catching her wrist, the same wrist Lawson had bruised weeks ago. The violent purple marks had faded into a pale yellow, almost completely healed. He brought her wrist to his lips and pressed a soft, lingering kiss against the skin. "I love you," Dominic said. The words hung in the dusty air of the warehouse, heavy and absolute. He hadn't planned to say it. He didn't know if he even knew how to love someone after 5 years of emotional rigor mortis. But as he looked at this fierce, beautiful woman who had stepped into his tomb and dragged him back into the light, he knew it was the truest thing he had ever spoken. Abigail's breath hitched. She stopped massaging his leg and looked into his dark, tortured eyes. The barriers between them were completely gone. "I love you too, Dominic." He pulled her into his lap, ignoring the protest of his muscles, and kissed her. It wasn't the frantic, desperate kiss of the library. It was deep, possessive, and painfully tender. It was a promise. When they finally broke apart, Dominic rested his forehead against hers. "I have to finish this, Abigail. I have to cut the head off the snake. Lawson and Costa think I'm dead. They think I'm a ghost. It's time I show them exactly who I am." He stood up, grabbing his cane. He looked across the room at Tommy, who was already on a burner phone, mobilizing their remaining forces. "Tommy," Dominic commanded, his voice ringing with absolute authority. "Call Captain O'Malley in the 12th District. Tell him to keep his cruisers away from River North tonight. Then call the assault teams. We are going to Jean and Georgetti's. Dress for a funeral. Midnight in Chicago." The rain had stopped, leaving the asphalt slick and reflecting the neon glow of the city. The Palmer Room, a private soundproof dining area on the second floor of Jean and Georgetti's steakhouse, was thick with cigar smoke and the smell of expensive red wine. Carmine Costa, a heavy-set man in a tailored silk suit, sat at the head of a long mahogany table, laughing raucously. Beside him sat Detective Richard Lawson. Lawson looked nervous, his eyes darting around the room, clutching a crystal glass of scotch. But a greedy, triumphant smirk played on his lips. On the table in front of him sat a heavy black duffel bag containing $300,000 in cash, his debt forgiven, and a bonus for delivering the ghost of the Gold Coast. "Relax, Ricky," Carmine boomed, slapping the detective on the back. "Russo is a pile of ash in Barrington right now. We own the ports. We own the shipping lanes. The city is ours." "I just want to make sure the girl burned with him," Lawson muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. "If she survived, she could testify about the lobby incident. She's a loose end." "My men said the whole house went up," Carmine dismissed with a wave of his hand. Stop worrying and drink your... The heavy oak doors of the private dining room swung open so violently they cracked against the walls. Carmine's 4 bodyguards instinctively reached for their weapons, but they froze. Stepping through the doorway were 6 heavily armed Russo enforcers, automatic weapons leveled directly at the Costa men. The room plunged into a suffocating, terrified silence. Then, the rhythmic thud-click of a carbon fiber cane echoed from the hallway. Dominic Russo walked into the room. He wore a pristine, midnight blue suit, tailored flawlessly over his broad shoulders. He stood tall, the silver at his temples catching the dim chandelier light. He didn't look like a cripple. He didn't look like a ghost. He looked like the devil himself, returned to claim his throne. Carmine Costa's cigar slipped from his fingers, falling onto his silk trousers. His face drained of all color. Dominic, you're dead. I have been dead for 5 years, Carmine, Dominic rumbled, his voice dark and deadly calm. He stepped further into the room. Behind him, flanked by Tommy and another guard, stood Abigail. She wore a sleek black coat, her auburn hair falling in loose waves. She looked directly at Richard Lawson, her expression utterly devoid of fear. Lawson choked on his scotch, scrambling backward in his chair, nearly knocking it over. "Abby," he whispered, his eyes wide with absolute horror. "Take their weapons," Dominic ordered. His men swiftly disarmed Costa's bodyguards, forcing them to their knees. Dominic walked slowly to the table. He looked at the duffel bag of cash, then up at Lawson. "Detective Lawson," Dominic said smoothly, "you have a terrible habit of putting your hands on things that do not belong to you. First it was my physical therapist. Then it was my city." Lawson was hyperventilating, his hands raised in surrender. "Russo, please. Costa made me do it. I owed them money. They threatened to kill me. Abby, tell him. Tell him I was desperate." Abigail stepped forward, standing shoulder to shoulder with Dominic. She looked down at the pathetic, trembling man who had once terrified her. "You weren't desperate, Richard. You were a coward. And you always will be." Dominic's eyes flicked to Tommy. "Get the detective out of my sight. Take him to the docks. Make sure he takes a very long, very deep swim in Lake Michigan." "No! No! Abby, please!" Lawson screamed as 2 Russo enforcers dragged him, kicking and screaming, from the room, his pleas fading down the corridor until they were abruptly silenced. Dominic turned his attention to Carmine Costa. The rival boss was shaking, staring at the barrel of Tommy's gun. "Carmine," Dominic said quietly, leaning his hands on the table. "You brought a war to my home. You tried to burn the only good thing that has entered my life in half a decade. Tonight, the Costa family ceases to exist in Chicago. Your territories belong to me. Your men work for me. And if you ever show your face in this city again, I won't send an army. I will come for you myself." Dominic didn't wait for a response. He turned his back on the broken man and offered his arm to Abigail. She took it, slipping her hand through his, and together they walked out of the restaurant, leaving the remnants of their enemies in the dust. 2 months later, the late September sun was warm, casting a golden hue over Millennium Park. The pathways were crowded with tourists, locals, and street musicians. Dominic Russo walked down the promenade, his cane tapping rhythmically against the pavement. He was in public. Under the open sky, surrounded by thousands of unpredictable strangers, and he wasn't afraid. He glanced down at the woman walking beside him. Abigail was laughing at something a street vendor had said, her ocean-grey eyes sparkling with life. She held a cup of coffee in one hand, and her other hand was firmly interlaced with Dominic's. On her left ring finger sat a breathtaking, flawless diamond that caught the autumn sunlight. His leg still hurt. The scars on his shoulder were still tight. He still commanded a dangerous, violent empire from the shadows of his penthouse. But as Dominic looked at his soon-to-be wife, he knew the cage was gone forever. He stopped walking, pulling her gently toward him. He wrapped his arm around her waist, kissing her softly amidst the bustling Chicago crowd. The ghost had returned to the world, and he had brought his queen with him. What an epic and deeply emotional finale for Dominic and Abigail. The Devil of Chicago completely dismantled his enemies and finally conquered his own demons, proving that true love can pull you out of the darkest depths. From the explosive siege at the Barrington compound to Dominic reclaiming his absolute power in the city, Abigail transformed from a terrified victim into the fearless queen of the Russo Empire. If you loved this incredible story and the intense journey of Dominic and Abigail, please hit that like button, share this video with your fellow romance fans, and subscribe to the channel for more amazing stories. Let me know in the comments which scene was your absolute favorite.